The air aboard the Aethel was not air in the terrestrial sense, but a meticulously synthesized blend, scrubbed of all emotional contaminants and calibrated for optimal cerebral function across multiple compatible species. It smelled faintly of ozone and polished chrome, a sterile, distant scent befitting the flagship of the galactic Aegis, a vast federation that considered itself the pinnacle of civil governance. The Aethel itself was less a vessel and more a mobile, burnished monument to the sheer, relentless scale of sovereign authority. Its hull was reinforced with trilattice neutronium alloys, yet its interiors were curved, seamless, and silent, designed to project an image of effortless, eternal peace. In the command spire's central nexus, a space of dark, reflective obsidian and starch art holography, sat Queen Lyra. She did not use the ergonomic multi-axis throne usually reserved for long-duration command. Instead, she chose a simple, circular plinth covered in plush hydrospun velvet, positioned perfectly to see the holographic display of the known 20 sectors of the Aegis. It was a seat of power, certainly, but to the few who watched her closely, it looked more like a cushion of absolute, crushing duty. She governed trillions, her ancestral burden, and every gesture, every micro-adjustment of her posture, was a reflection of that staggering responsibility. Her garments, woven from shimmering, delicate monofilament threads, absorbed and reflected the ambient light, making her appear to glow with a contained, internal luminescence. The fabric was exquisitely cut, designed not for warmth or comfort, but for the precise, unyielding geometry of royal mandate. Her features were fine, her skin the color of polished ivory, and her overall presentation was one of perfect, contradictory majesty. But if you were close enough, if you had earned the right to watch her for long periods, you could see it, a flicker of profound, almost existential weariness that crossed her eyes whenever the central holographic map dimmed or went idle. Her elaborate, gravity-defying hairstyle, a cultural necessity to accommodate the weight of her crown, also served the unintended function of partially obscuring the single physical marker that set her apart from baseline human women. Just visible through the carefully arranged dark spirals of hair were the tips of her graceful, elongated ears, tapering to a fine point, like delicate, perfect autumn leaves of bone and cartilage. They were a signature of her Aethel heritage, beautiful and entirely foreign, yet usually hidden by the imposing, diamond-spun crown of the Aegis. Observing her, as he often did, was Commander Kaelen Vance. He was a terrestrial liaison, a xenolinguist stationed on the Aethel as part of an interspecies treaty intended to promote cultural exchange, which mostly amounted to translating ministerial demands into terms that wouldn't incite an interstellar incident. Kaelen's official purpose was diplomacy. His unwritten, secret reality had become an involuntary, silent infatuation. He sat on a folding stool near the data-slate terminal, ostensibly reviewing the latest protocols for intersector trade tariff harmonization, but his focus was magnetic, drawn to the silent, immobile figure of the Queen. He wasn't drawn to the power. He'd seen enough power to know it was often just a cage built of responsibilities. He saw the woman beneath the title, the one who sometimes sought refuge in the auxiliary observation deck long after the ship's internal chronometer had cycled past sleep hours. This auxiliary deck was a narrow, unglamorous corridor far from the command spire, with a simple, unfettered viewport that looked out into the spinning, infinite pinpricks of space. It was here, over 2 years of shared illicit quiet, that their silent dynamic had formed. Lyra would appear in her simple, dark sleeping robes that felt like a deliberate renunciation of her monofilament daytime armor, and Kaelen would materialize with 2 steaming cups of vat-grown synthetic coffee, a beverage Lyra once famously described as tasting like a compromise, but smelling of hope. One such night, Lyra was slumped, truly slumped, against the viewport's crystalline casing, her crown resting on the console beside her like a heavy, glittering bomb. Her hair was down, and the full elegance of her pointed ears was revealed, sharp against the starlight, yet she seemed not to care about their exposure. She was lamenting the mind-numbing repetition of her royal proclamation voice, the perfectly modulated, emotionally sterile tone required for official addresses. "It's not just the words, Kaelen," she sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "It's the resonance. The protocol dictates an emotional flatness that is actively damaging to my sanity. I feel like a sophisticated, very expensive synthesized recording of myself." Kaelen offered a tired smile. "It maintains stability, Your Majesty." "Stability is terribly boring, Commander, and soul-crushingly repetitive. Take tonight's incident." The Minister of Stellar Mining, a delightful man with the vocal range of a small, frightened moon cricket, required a formal declaration of appreciation for his innovative use of localized neutrino scanning in the Xylos system. "I swear," she complained with genuine exasperation, pushing a loose strand of hair back to fully reveal the striking line of her ear, "if I have to pronounce the full title of the Minister of Stellar Mining one more time, I'm going to have the whole planet detonated. And then I'll realize I can't, because that would be inefficient. You see, even my impulse control is based on bureaucratic necessity." Kaelen couldn't help but chuckle, a low, quiet sound that felt entirely too human for the sterile setting. It was during these moments of dry, exhausted humor, punctuated by her casual threats of galactic demolition, that Kaelen felt the true Lyra emerge. The sheer vulnerability she showed, despite her elegant, almost ethereal alien features, made the chasm of their social standing feel manageable, almost irrelevant. He knew his feelings were illogical, even treasonous, given that she was a monarch and he, essentially, a highly educated foreign translator. But the situation was anything but stable now. The escalating intensity of the political climate was a pressure cooker, and the external threat of the Null-Space Pirates was tightening the coil of stress around the entire Aegis. The pirates, less swashbuckling villains and more highly organized, technologically adept raiders using proprietary folding space drives to bypass established defense grids, were becoming a serious, existential problem. Their latest raid had crippled 3 key trade routes, and the political infighting among Lyra's subordinates, each one maneuvering for favor or positioning in the event of her failure, was relentless. Kaelen felt it too, the omnipresent fear that the calm silence of the Aethel was merely the eye of a hurricane. He watched Lyra one last time before their illegal break ended. Her gaze, usually fixed on the distant stars or on the weighty political problem of the hour, lingered on him for a beat too long. It was a look that wasn't royal, or weary, or even humorous. It was simply searching. She reached out a finger and traced the cool, hard edge of her diamond-spun crown sitting next to the console, a heavy, oppressive object that magnified her sound-sensitive ears with its sheer presence. "Kaelen," she whispered, her voice stripped of its proclamation resonance. Tell me there's a life somewhere in the cosmos where one can simply breathe." The starlight reflected in her eyes, making her look both impossibly alien and desperately human, and the raw honesty of the question hung heavy in the air, a silent prelude to the desperate decision she would soon make. The fragile peace that had defined the Queen's quiet evenings with Kaelen was violently extinguished by a cascade failure originating in the Cygnus perimeter. A key Aegis defense satellite, a technological marvel known as Sentinel Sigma, went silent, not from enemy fire, but from an internal, highly sophisticated malware packet. The satellite was under the command of Consul Zarek, Lyra's closest and most irritatingly polished political rival. The ensuing blackout in the Cygnus sector was immediately capitalized upon by the Null-Space Pirates, who executed 3 simultaneous, surgically precise raids on unprotected trade convoys. The political fallout was instant, brutal, and louder than any plasma cannon. Lyra found herself locked in the neural net war room, a sensory deprivation environment where reality was replaced by pure tactical data streams. For 72 hours, she wrestled with the simulated projections of Aegis collapse, fed only on nutrient paste and the biting, digitized voice of Consul Zarek, who used the virtual platform to endlessly suggest her lack of foresight was the root cause. She watched the glowing red lines of the simulated pirate advance creep across the holographic map of her domain, and she realized, with chilling clarity, that the crown was no longer a symbol of governance. It was a distraction target. Her life was not her own. It was merely an armature, a delicate, expensive stand upon which the heavy, sparkling object could be displayed until it was shattered by political maneuvering or pirate aggression. It was in the simulated ruins of the Aegis core world of Aethel Prime, as the neural net predicted a 98% chance of catastrophic infrastructure failure, that Lyra finally broke. She didn't scream or rage. She simply stopped the simulation, the sudden silence of the war room deafening. She stared at the blank wall, her slender, elegant ears catching the faint hum of the cooling systems. Her hands, which usually rested with regal stillness, flexed once, a desperate clench of pure exhaustion. She was done performing. She returned to her private quarters and, bypassing all standard royal communication protocols, used an ancient, offline cipher engine Kaelen had once shown her, a curiosity he claimed was only used by terrestrial historians. She sent a message, not to his command terminal, but to a private, encrypted data slate he carried in his tunic pocket. Prepare for immediate departure. I need a change of clothing and a terrible cover story. If you mention efficiency, I will ensure you spend the rest of your life filing tax returns in a black hole. Kaelen received the message during a staff briefing on the logistics of distributing emergency bio-shield patches. The slate vibrated once against his ribs, and the cryptic, very Lyra threat made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. This was not a drill. This was an edict of exile. Operating on a pure surge of adrenaline and a loyalty he dared not rationalize, he set the wheels in motion. His plan was audacious, bordering on insane. It involved the rarely checked biotransfer module, a complex piece of Aethel technology designed for the instant, surgical extraction and replacement of high-value personnel during planetary conflicts. It was essentially a rapid, short-range teleportation unit, usually utilized for official deployment, but Kaelen intended to use it for undeployment. The module's secondary function allowed for a brief, localized manipulation of the ship's energy conduits. Lyra, dressed in her simple robes, met him in a utility corridor near the Aethelred's massive fusion core reactor. The air here was hot, turbulent, and smelled like burned minerals. "My apologies for the location, Your Majesty," Kaelen whispered, working frantically on the biotransfer console. "It's the only place with enough background energy noise to conceal your signature." "I find the raw heat quite refreshing," Lyra replied, her voice low and even. "It's certainly more honest than the synthesized air of the command spire. I do hope you have something suitable for the trip. I find I have developed a phobia of my own fabrics." "I have clothing," Kaelen confirmed, wiping sweat from his brow. "And a means of egress. We have 30 seconds. I'm staging a temporary cloaking of your energy signature and vital signs within the core reactor's output. For 15 seconds, you will appear, electronically speaking, to be a mild surge in the coolant pumps. We jump then." The console flashed violently, bathing Lyra's pointed ears and pale face in harsh red light. The jump was instantaneous and disorienting, a brief, stomach-lurching plunge through synthesized space. One moment they were facing the glowing lattice of the reactor core. The next, they were standing in a small, cramped cargo hold of a civilian refueling station known for its lax security and excellent vat-grown nutrient paste. The real test began here, the disguise. Kaelen had managed to procure a duffel bag of terrestrial garments from the station's vintage supply store, a place Lyra would later describe as smelling overwhelmingly of distress and questionable biological residue. Lyra pulled out a simple, dark cotton shirt and held it between two fingers, her expression one of utter fascination mixed with profound distaste. "This material," she said, slowly picking at the weave like it was a complex biological hazard, "is derived from a plant, yes? It feels so aggressively unsmoothed, Commander. Is this supposed to feel rough?" "It's cotton, Lyra. It's durable and completely unremarkable. The goal is to be unremarkable. But I have an empire of synthesized smoothness. I rule in pure comfort," she protested, dropping the shirt as if it had stung her. "This feels like I'm wearing the shredded remnants of a political rival's bad day." The clothes were one thing, but her ears were the critical vulnerability. They were too distinct, too perfect, immediately marking her as an Aethel noble. Lyra, with a lifetime of elaborate, heavy crowns and complicated hairstyles, was completely unprepared for the concept of casual concealment. Kaelen tried everything: a thick wool beanie, a wide-brimmed sun hat, even a scarf he'd purchased that was meant for protecting against dust storms. None of it worked. The pointed tips of her ears either poked aggressively through the material or forced the headwear into a comical, uneven angle. This led to a desperate, last-minute shopping excursion to the station's main market hub, a cacophony of vendors selling contraband plasma coils and questionable synth snakes. It was here, in a stall specializing in brightly colored, cheaply manufactured leisure wear, that Lyra settled on a solution that was, frankly, terrifying. "This," she announced, holding up a baseball cap that was several sizes too large, shockingly sequined in a hideous iridescent purple, and clearly designed for a child's birthday party, "is perfectly distracting. No one will be looking at my ears when they are looking at this." "Lyra, with respect, it looks like a disco ball had a violent confrontation with a textile mill." "It makes you more remarkable," Kaelen pleaded, running a hand through his own hair. "Nonsense. It signals local eccentric with poor fashion sense." That is far less alarming than galactic sovereign on the run. Observe. She pulled the cap low over her forehead. The fabric pressed down on the delicate points of her ears, causing her to wince slightly, but effectively obscuring them. She paired it with a pair of ludicrously large, circular, gold-plated earrings that dangled precariously beneath the cap's brim, completing the look of a fugitive who had lost a serious bet. Are we absolutely certain the cultural analysis regarding mid-century terrestrial chic was accurate, Kaelen? She deadpanned, looking utterly ridiculous, a cosmic queen disguised as a slightly angry space tourist. The analysis was, perhaps flawed, Kaelen conceded, fighting to keep a straight face. He then activated the final piece of their defense, a powerful, though slightly illegal, personal cloaking field emitter. It was small, worn like a wristband, and didn't make them invisible. Instead, it subtly messed with low-grade surveillance scanners and biological reading fields, adding minor distortions and visual noise to their presence, making them look blurry and unremarkable, like faces in a crowd that one immediately forgets. They slipped away onto the Stardust Drifter, a barely functional civilian freighter that smelled of old fuel and desperation. Lyra carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, heavy data chip. This chip contained a deep storage archive of her true memories, her biometrics, and the immutable code of her sovereignty. She planned to keep it only until they reached their destination, a forgotten, backwater fringe colony known only as Cinder 5, where she intended to delete it, erasing Lyra the Queen forever. As the Stardust Drifter's ancient ion drives sputtered to life, pushing them away from the sterile lights of the refueling station and into the cold black, Kaelen glanced at the woman beside him. The iridescent purple sequins of her hat caught the distant starlight, glinting maniacally. "You realize, Commander," she murmured, adjusting the awful cap, "that I have just traded a destiny of ruling trillions for a destiny of wearing this garment. The irony is excruciating. It's temporary, Lyra. Just until Cinder 5. "I hope so," she said, staring out at the void. "Because if this is what freedom looks like, I might be forced to consider the bureaucratic necessity of going back just to outlaw terrible headwear." The humor was genuine, but underneath it, Kaelen could feel the tremor of fear. She was giving up everything for a chance at a different kind of life, a life she knew nothing about, and the irreversibility of the choice was now heavier than any crown. Cinder 5, the planet orbiting a sickly yellow dwarf star, was the antithesis of the polished, silent majesty Lyra had known. It was a study in brutal, low-tech survival. The atmosphere was filtered and breathable, but perpetually thick with fine, metallic dust blown up from the surface, a constant, abrasive presence that seemed to coat every surface and penetrate every textile. The light was harsh, unfiltered, and carried a high concentration of irritating solar radiation, forcing Kaelen and Lyra, now answering exclusively to the name Fae, to wear heavy, polarized eye shields whenever they stepped outside the cramped confines of their apartment block. The apartment itself was built of cheap, utilitarian polymer blocks, smelling faintly of stale synth smoke and mildew. It was powered by a sputtering, deeply unreliable fusion generator located 3 stories down, which sounded less like an engine of infinite energy and more like a large, asthmatic beast perpetually clearing its throat. The drone was a low, unsettling vibration that resonated deep in Lyra's chest and, more acutely, through the fine cartilage of her elongated ears, which were usually protected from such raw sonic pollution by the atmospheric scrubbers of the Aethel. She constantly found herself massaging the tips of her ears beneath the oppressive brim of the sequined cap, trying to alleviate the low-grade auditory assault. "The inefficiency is breathtaking, Kaelen," she stated one afternoon, observing the slow, irregular flicker of the overhead strip light. "A generator that requires this level of auditory output for this minimal level of energy input should be considered a monument to poor engineering, not a means of habitation." "It's 20 years old, Lyra. And it's cheap," Kaelen replied, already covered in a thin sheen of red dust from his new job. He was trying to figure out how to jury-rig the air filtration unit with a piece of repurposed magnetic sheeting he'd salvaged. Lyra, facing the true existential terror of her exile, ignored the technical discussion. Her royal hands, which once signed trillion credit treaties and held the scepter of command with unshakable stillness, were now expected to operate a primitive, human-standard nutrient synthesis unit, a stove, as Kaelen called it. The comedy of this confrontation was dark and immediate. Her first task, boiling water for a packet of high-protein, vacuum-dried rations. She stared at the 4 metallic burners on the stovetop, completely bewildered. You turn the dial counterclockwise to increase the temperature? This lacks all logical gradient, she muttered, adjusting the iridescent cap on her head, which still felt like the greatest personal sacrifice she had made for freedom. She turned the dial too far, too fast. The cooking element, already struggling against the generator's uneven power supply, decided to stage a miniature rebellion. Instead of heating the water, it produced a small, contained, but intensely acrid kitchen fire. The smoke alarm, an ancient, shrill device, immediately began to shriek, assaulting Lyra's sensitive ears with a piercing noise that made her physically recoil, dropping the pot. Kaelen, hearing the sound from the adjacent room, was instantly there, moving with the practiced urgency of a man who knew he was living with a volatile sovereign. He grabbed the lid and slammed it down on the small inferno, suffocating the flames. Lyra stood mesmerized, staring at the small, smoking black mark on the synth tile counter. Her wide, pale eyes held a mix of horror and profound, detached fascination. "It appears," she stated dryly, slowly brushing a plume of fine, gray soot off the shoulder of her cotton shirt, which she had begrudgingly begun to accept, "that I have accidentally weaponized the starch. A potentially fascinating military application, but highly inappropriate for meal preparation." Kaelen, breathless, just shook his head and offered a tired, genuine laugh. "It's called burning dinner, Lyra. It happens. We'll stick to the pre-processed bars tonight. I am the sovereign of 20 sectors. I command entire fleets to fold space. And yet, I am functionally incompetent in the creation of basic sustenance." She sighed, the weariness that used to cross her eyes now replaced by a kind of bewildered resignation. This was their new reality, a stripping away of all power, all luxury, and all automation. The raw, gritty texture of cinder. 5 was an abrasive that wore down the shine of Lyra's royalty, revealing Fae. Kaelen saw her flaws daily, her complete inability to grasp the concept of the colony's fiat currency, requiring him to take over all purchasing, as she either overpaid by a factor of 10 or tried to pay with the useless, decorative metal pieces from her old garments. She couldn't perform the simple, necessary mathematics for the ration distribution, declaring, "Numbers that do not end in trillion seem fundamentally unstable to me." She also had a constant, irrational fear of touching anything remotely sticky or organically messy. If a piece of fruit juice, a genuine novelty for her, spilled, she would freeze and unconsciously issue a series of increasingly frantic commands to non-existent automated cleaning drones. "Ethos 7, immediate biohazard neutralization," she would snap, pointing imperiously at a drop of spilled syrup. "Kaelen, your floor unit is unresponsive. I demand a high-priority scrub." Kaelen would simply wipe the spill with a damp cloth, suppressing a smile. "No drones here, Lyra. Just hands. You're going to have to get used to the friction." The true terror for Lyra was not the dirt, the noise, or the lack of synthesized comfort, but the sudden acute awareness of her own functional uselessness outside the highly structured, hyper-technological bubble of the Aegis. Meanwhile, Kaelen embraced the change. He found work at the colony's Central Agricultural Cooperative, a physically demanding and dirty job repairing the complex, antiquated hydroponic filtration arrays that kept the colony alive. He came back every evening coated in dried nutrient slurry, smelling of oil and sweat. He was exhausted, but he was also real. He was solving tangible, immediate problems, a far cry from his previous job translating the self-important jargon of ministers. Lyra would watch him meticulously clean the grime from his hands and face, admiring the raw competence in his movements that were alien to her own life of effortless command. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, and a deep, gnawing anxiety began to settle in her stomach. Their affection, stripped of the grand, dangerous romance of the Aethel, now had to survive the scrutiny of shared, grinding struggle. Kaelen saw her utterly flustered, useless, and occasionally comical moments of incompetence, and still offered her a patient smile and the least burnt portion of the synthesized food. He found these flaws endearing. They confirmed that his love was for the woman with the long, pointed ears and the impossibly high standards, not the queen whose empire she had set aside. But the test remained unspoken, a quiet, internal tension that was harder to bear than the constant hum of the generator. Lyra kept asking herself, "Is he tolerating me, or loving me?" If this grinding poverty, this constant struggle with the most basic elements of human survival, were permanent, Would his gaze still hold affection, or would it eventually settle into pity for a deposed monarch who couldn't even manage the currency exchange? The low-grade anxiety of their situation was occasionally punctuated by a more external threat. The settlement's communications officer, a gaunt, paranoid man named Jax, frequently whispered rumors of bounty hunters operating in the neighboring sectors, tracking minor fugitives and disgraced officials. The proximity of this threat, while not immediate, served as a constant low-frequency reminder that their exile, despite its miserable accommodations, was still desperately fragile. One evening, as Kaelen was meticulously polishing a piece of chrome from a salvaged filtration pipe, Lyra watched him from her seat, still wearing the sequined cap, which was now thankfully muted by a thick layer of Cinder 5 dust. "Kaelen," she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the sputtering generator, "when you look at me now, what do you see? I am dustier, I am incapable of operating a simple hot plate, and I cost you all your earnings when I attempt to buy protein bars. Do you ever miss the efficiency of my former self?" Kaelen stopped polishing, his eyes thoughtful. "I see, Lyra," he said simply. "And I don't miss the efficiency. I like that you can't run a stove. It means you need me to cook, and I need you to advise me on the proper resonance of my stirring spoon. It's balanced." He smiled, a tired, genuine smile that cut straight through the tension and the fear. But Lyra knew that the true gravity of the question, the one about her title and her power, had yet to be fully asked or answered. The finality of their choice, the true test of Kaelen's love for the woman beneath the crown, still awaited them in the dusty silence of Cinder 5. The sputtering, asthmatic drone of the fusion generator deep within the Cinder 5 apartment block had become the soundtrack to Lyra's exile. It was a monotonous, low-frequency hum that grated against the fine points of her ears, a constant reminder of the fragile, low-tech reality she inhabited. For 3 weeks, this life of abrasive simplicity had been their sanctuary. Kaelen was repairing hydroponic filtration arrays for a meager living. Lyra, or Faye, was perfecting the art of not burning water, and their love had settled into a quiet, enduring companionship born of shared, dusty adversity. The rupture began, fittingly, with technology. Kaelen had been cultivating a necessary, if dubious, friendship with a local cyber hacker named Wrench, a nervous man with 3 optical implants and a penchant for cheap, high-sugar synthetic drinks. Wrench was the only source for reliable fusion coil components needed to keep their apartment functioning, and in exchange, Kaelen occasionally assisted Wrench with translation of obscure terrestrial software code. One evening, Wrench had brought over a salvaged control unit for a defunct gravity stabilizer, hoping Kaelen could identify its power requirements. He noticed the personal cloaking field emitter Kaelen kept charging on the windowsill, the very device that blurred their outlines to low-grade scanners. Curious, and likely bored, Wrench had done what all hackers do. He poked it. He accessed the device's latent diagnostic memory, where a hidden, encrypted data file lay dormant. Lyra was in the kitchen, carefully measuring out the precise, mathematically sound quantity of nutrient powder for their evening meal, when the air turned cold. Wrench, normally a jittery fountain of low-level data chatter, was silent. He stood frozen by the window, his 3 eyes wide, staring at the crystalline display of his interface slate. "Kaelen," Wrench whispered, his voice cracking, "your girlfriend, she's not just a bad cook." Kaelen dropped the salvaged copper wire he was braiding. "Wrench, what did you do?" Wrench held up the slate, which was displaying a cascade of crimson text and a fully detailed, non-blurred Aethel biometric signature. Above it, stamped in immutable gold code, was the title, Lyra, sole sovereign of the Aegis. The cloaking emitter, when deeply interrogated, had yielded its original programming target, the Queen's profile, in a bid to prove its operational readiness. "This is an entire galaxy's worth of fugitive," Wrench stammered, his third eye twitching uncontrollably. "I just tapped into a Tier 1 royal profile. Do you know what the bounty on this data is? It's enough to buy Cinder 5 and give everyone a perfectly clean, new apartment." Lyra, standing perfectly still, looked down at the handful of nutrient powder she was holding. She was no longer Faye. The dust, the struggle, the constant, maddening inefficiency of the stove, all of it dissolved. She was a queen discovered. Kaelen immediately lunged for the slate, smashing it against the wall. The fragile crystalline display fractured, and the incriminating data vanished into sparks. "You tell no one, Wrench," Not a single soul. You forget every digit of that code right now. Wrench scrambled backward, clutching his head. Forget? Commander, my neural interface just ingested a royal encryption key. I need 3 hours and a sedative just to process the concept of forgetting it. But the damage was done. They had a window, a few hours at most, before Wrench's panic shock wore off and he sold the information, whether intentionally or through an involuntary neurological leak. The immediate danger was not the Null-Space Pirates they had fled, but the political rivals, the Consul Zarek types, who would pay a king's ransom to retrieve Lyra and either imprison her or, worse, use her as a puppet. Kaelen slammed the apartment door shut, locking the flimsy magnetic deadbolt. The room was small, lit only by the sputtering, yellow-tinged strip light. Lyra slowly turned, her face expressionless, her pale eyes shadowed by the brim of the ridiculous, dusty sequined cap she still wore. "Well," she said, her voice entirely flat, "that was an unexpected termination of my probationary period as a citizen. We need to move, Lyra. We can still get to the Stardust Drifter before sunrise." Kaelen was already pulling their few meager belongings into a synthetic fiber sack. "No," Lyra said, her voice regaining a fraction of its old, royal resonance. "We stop running. The question that brought us here must be answered first, Kaelen. Tonight." She walked to the only flat surface, a rickety wooden desk, and placed her hand on the sequined cap. Slowly, with the deliberate, ritualistic motion of a monarch performing an abdication, she lifted it off. The gesture was profound. Her hair, which had been pressed down and messy, sprung free. Her uniquely long, pointed ears were fully revealed, sharp and elegant against the harsh yellow light, entirely unprotected from the low drone of the generator. She was Lyra, the Aethel Queen, stripped down to nothing but her biological truth and a dirty cotton shirt. The absence of her diamond crown felt like a physical ache across her brow. She turned to him. "I am Lyra, the sovereign of the Aegis, an entity of immense, galaxy-spanning power. I could offer you entire planets, Kaelen. I could elevate you to the highest rank in the Aegis fleet. I am the figure of stability you once served and admired." She paused, then gestured around the dusty, cramped, smoky room. "But here I am just Faye, the woman who burns toast and can't count small numbers because she never had to think about anything less than 7 digits. The one who issues royal commands to a damp cloth. I know you loved the Queen, Commander. But here is the crux of my exile, the great, terrifying equation I ran away to solve." Her eyes held his, piercing through the exhaustion and the grime. She spoke the sentence that had been haunting her across 20 sectors and a lifetime of duty. "Would you still choose me if I wasn't a queen?" Kaelen stopped packing. He let the sack fall to the floor with a soft thump. He walked toward her, slowly, stepping over a discarded wrapper from a nutrient bar. The tension was thick enough to require a molecular slicer to cut through it. He reached out and gently touched the tip of her ear, a gesture he'd always avoided out of deep, formal respect for her personage and her crown. The skin was impossibly soft, the cartilage delicate. His thumb gently traced the elegant, foreign line. "Lyra," he murmured, "I watched the Queen in the war room, and I saw a woman being shredded by duty. I admired her strength, yes, but I fell in love with a woman who, despite being a galactic ruler, was hopelessly inept at ordinary life." He leaned closer, a smile creeping across his dust-caked face. "You asked if I'd choose you as Faye, the terrible cook. The answer is yes. I'd choose you," he declared, his voice firm, "even if you were still wearing that horrific iridescent baseball cap, which, by the way, I intend to dispose of immediately. It clashes horribly with the red dust of Cinder 5. The color sequencing is unstable." The light humor, a perfect, terrestrial-grade jab at her absurd sacrifice, cut the tension beautifully. Lyra let out a small, startled laugh that sounded impossibly clear and free in the close space. It sealed his answer. He loved her, not despite her flaws, but because they made her real and dependent on him for the simple things. Before the moment could stretch further, the air crackled with a violent, impossible energy. The rudimentary communications unit in the corner, a cheap low-band transceiver usually reserved for weather reports, screamed to life, emitting a blast of pure, highly urgent, encrypted data that bypassed every firewall and protocol Cinder 5 possessed. It was an Aegis message, marked with the highest possible priority: imminent collapse event. The message stream, once decrypted by Lyra's latent processing ability, confirmed her greatest fears. Consul Zarek and her rivals, paralyzed by their own political jockeying and unable to agree on a united response, had left the fleet vulnerable. The Null-Space Pirates, utilizing their proprietary folding space drives, were massing for a decisive push against the vulnerable Aegis core fleet. The prediction models indicated a full-scale rout within 12 standard hours if a central command authority, Lyra, did not immediately take the helm and deploy the counterfolding signature dampeners only she had the access codes for. The galaxy, it turned out, could not simply function without its sovereign. The choice was no longer about if they returned, but how. Lyra stood taller, the sheer weight of responsibility, which she had shed for a brief, dusty moment, settling back onto her shoulders. She was still Faye, the woman who learned to make coffee for herself, but she was Lyra, the Queen, too. Her journey hadn't been an escape from her title, it had been a necessary calibration of her soul. "We go back," she stated, her voice resonating with its powerful proclamation-grade clarity, but now layered with a new, quiet authority forged in inadequacy. "But we go back on my terms. Kaelen," she commanded, stepping over the discarded cap, "get that cipher engine of yours. We're sending Zarek a message that he will spend the rest of his life trying to translate. I want the Ethelred to jump to these coordinates immediately." The coordinates she transmitted were not the nearest Aegis port, but a desolate high-gravity sector that only Lyra knew contained a hidden, automated Aethel defense shipyard capable of deploying a pre-programmed fleet of Sentinel-class drones. They would not return to the Ethelred as fugitives, but as a force of nature. They returned in a blaze of glory, not aboard the slow Stardust Drifter, but on a hijacked, high-speed patrol cutter Kaelen commandeered using Wrench's partially scrambled data, a small act of necessary treason. Lyra was no longer wearing the cotton shirt. She had retrieved a spare, simple, but immaculate set of monofilament ceremonial robes from the hidden cache on the defense cutter. When she stepped back onto the bridge of the Ethelred, reclaiming her crown, her ears were bare, uncovered by the heavy layers of old formality. The Aegis officers and Consul Zarek, pale with shock, watched as Lyra, now wielding the authority of a ruler who had faced life without power, issued commands that saved the fleet from the pirate attack and permanently sidelined her political rivals. Lyra's rule had fundamentally changed. She still wore the crown, but she wore it lighter. The weight of her duty was now balanced by the knowledge that she could, at any moment, walk away and simply be Faye. Commander Kaelen Vance, the xenolinguist, now held the most powerful informal advisory role in the Aegis, his authority stemming not from rank, but from the fact that he was the only person Lyra trusted to tell her when she was being bureaucratically inefficient, or if her newly established, highly advanced royal nutrient synthesizer was about to start another kitchen fire. They had found their balance, ruling not just by decree and technology, but by love, a shared appreciation for the terrible absurdity of life, and the ability to cook a decent, non-weaponized meal. The memory of the dusty, sputtering life on Cinder 5 was the constant, necessary counterweight to the crushing scale of a galaxy, and Lyra, the queen with the long, pointed ears and the newfound domestic competence, finally felt that she could truly breathe.